Good afternoon. My name is Craig Shelley. I'm a managing director at Orr Group. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is, as we enter week somewhere between 515 of quarantine and civil unrest and everything else going on in the world. I appreciate those of you that continue to spend time with us in these webinars that we've been doing regularly. If you're here for the first time, thank you. Just give you a little bit of context. We're going to have just basically a little bit of a conversation. Try and get some thoughts from some people we really respect about what they see and what they think about what's going on in the world, what it means now for fundraising, what it means now for nonprofit leadership, and what we think may be coming next. If you have questions, you'll see there's a Q&A function at the bottom. You can pop questions in there. We'll try and work them into the conversation, or I might try and answer you back on the chat, or we might, I don't know, we might ignore your question entirely, but we'll try not to do that. And we'll try to get to everything, make this as participatory as we can. Quickly, before I introduce you to our panelists and we sort of get right into this conversation, want to set a little bit of context around sort of what we're thinking, sort of how we're seeing the world right now, and then we'll jump off in the conversation from there. I think, one of the things that we probably would have said 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks ago was, things were going to change, right? There's some sort of change was coming. I think we're all at the point now where we've recognized change is here, right? Change is not coming, it is here. The world we sort of lived in and operated and worked in 5 months ago, that doesn't exist anymore. But at the same time, I think we'd all recognize where we're going to be 5 months from now also doesn't exist right now. So on just about every sort of level, I think we're in the cliched uncertain times. And then all of that's happening in this world where there's kind of this blurring between where you live and where you work, right? I know I definitely see that and feel that even more now, I think, than I did a few weeks ago. Kids are starting to get out of school, school's slowing down, just things are getting different. And you're realizing now also that you've been in this for 3 months and you're going to be in it for probably another 2-3 months at least, I would guess. You're starting to recognize like this is now a way of life. But one thing that I think is clear to all of us as fundraisers is, philanthropy has a role to play. It's playing a role now. It's going to continue to play a role. People will keep raising money. People will keep giving money. I know in the first week or two, I was in conversations around, we need to plan for no one's going to give any money again for the rest of the year. That is not what's happened. And in fact, even causes not related to the pandemic, or causes not related to social justice, have continued to raise money at a pretty good clip. There's commonality in why that is. And then not everybody has, and there's commonality why some of those have not. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I do think money is going to continue to be raised. Now, the new wrinkle, probably in the last 3 or 4 weeks, at least from my perspective, is now we're starting to be bombarded, more and more by images and circumstances, whether you're a donor, wherever you live, whether you're a fundraiser, that is starting to really sort of shake the foundation of the world we live in, right? And so no longer is it we have this pandemic and we'll get through it. We're starting to really kind of the come home to roost, so to speak, of lots of sort of challenges we've had as a society. So that sort of convergence of events, that's definitely new, right? Like that this is, once every 3 or 4 generations, if ever, have we sort of seen so many things. So congratulations, you're all living in interesting times, right? That's the cliche, may you be cursed to do so. So we'll get into all that. What does that mean for us as leaders, fundraisers? We'll talk a little bit about it. I have 2 guests with us today, 2 people that I have a great deal of respect for and have had the opportunity to get to know a little bit. So I wanted to invite them to share some ideas with you. First, Jethro Miller. Jethro is the Chief Development Officer at Planned Parenthood Federations of America, so the sort of national organization for Planned Parenthood. Has a rich fundraising background, having been at the Red Cross, leading major gifts there. Worked in a number of other organizations, including a competitor consulting firm of ours, but just really has sort of a viewpoint, a truly national view on fundraising that not a lot of us really get to see. Had the opportunity to first meet Jethro. We connected sort of at a breakfast for AFP, which there is a little bit of a common thread amongst all of us there, which you'll hear about in a second. But I've been fortunate that we've been able to become friendly and keep in touch. And I'm glad that Jethro's with us today. So Jethro, thank you very much. Also with us is Tycely Williams. Similarly to Jethro, has a great experience at lots of organizations, including the Red Cross. I'm starting to wonder if the Red Cross doesn't just breed fundraisers that I really respect, because there's a lot of them, but also worked at the Red Cross. Currently, the VP of Development at America's Promise Alliance. Prior was at YWCA, leading their national fundraising. I spent time at the YMCA in DC. So really similarly has a unique view at fundraising. But then I would also say the way we met, sort of randomly, we have a mutual friend, Barbara O'Reilly, who's now the president of the AFP chapter in DC. I was in DC, their board was having dinner. Barbara said, why don't you come to dinner? Those of you that know me, I don't pass up free food or free drinks very often, so I joined them for dinner. Randomly got sat next to Tycely, and just have been very fortunate that we've been able to keep in touch since then. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. And let's jump right in. One last reminder on the housekeeping. You can put questions on the Q&A. If you have any tech sort of challenges or just want to give some shout outs, you can put those in the chat function on the side. And we'll get right into our conversation. So I know both of you and your organizations, deeply committed to, actively engaged in ensuring equity, right? As all of us have sort of wrestled with the systemic shortcomings, that have brought us to sort of this necessary point of unrest in our country. As a fundraiser, I know I've started to think a lot about sort of where does philanthropy fit into that? On the one hand, I believe that many of us have worked for organizations that have been active combatants against inequity, have been active advocates for those, and given voice to people that don't have it. But at the same time, there's a huge power dynamic within philanthropy that is wildly uneven, right? So at the same time, while we have organizations combating this, we're very much sort of part of the system. There's no doubt about it. Tycely, when we spoke last week, you sort of talked a lot about this idea of a power dynamic, which I thought was really interesting. Similarly, you had a real thought-provoking piece in the Nonprofit Times around this subject. And I guess there's not a real great specific question in here, but I just, would love to hear your thoughts on sort of equity and philanthropy and sort of where we are in all of this. And I'm going to put the link to that article that I just referenced into the chat for everybody. But Tycely, how are you thinking about all this?
Absolutely. So Craig, in the spirit of inclusiveness, I want to thank you for the invitation, and it's going to be a wonderful time chatting with you and Jethro. So I'm super, super excited about that. So I think as everyone, as we look in the rearview mirror, it's hard to tell from day to day which headline is literally gripping at our hearts. Over the last couple of days, I think not only as a Black person living in America, but as a living, breathing being, so much compounded. It wasn't just the unfortunate murder of George Floyd. It was Breonna Taylor. It was Ahmaud Arbery. And then since then, there has since been countless other incidents. And so I found myself really struggling because as a leader within the not-for-profit space, there were these headlines coming out that I felt as if I really needed to celebrate. It was really wonderful to see so many people opening up their wallets and contributing, and literally seeing GoFundMe accounts rise to levels that they had never been. But then I found myself really, really conflicted because of the reason and the rationale by which the generosity needed to be activated. I think we all have these conversations with our teams to say, wouldn't it be great if we put ourselves out of business, right? Like, do we really want to have a case for support, or do we really want to create a world where resources aren't needed to combat certain things? And so that's where I found myself, Craig, just really conflicted, having a lot of mixed emotions around protection of the status quo / having a desire and an interest to usher in positive, radical change versus this incremental change it seems we've been making decade over decade, especially within the human services space. So that just led me to sit with the pen and to give what I think is rightful acknowledgement for the generosity, while at the same time creating the space to challenge us to do and be better. I think within this movement, we as not-for-profit leaders and fundraisers really need to pay attention to the power dynamic. I think when you look at what type of change has come about, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, and I look at legacy organizations that have NAACP, Urban League, and they have not been able, according to some standards, to usher in the systemic change that communities have asked for. And so you see unmet needs being met by the creation of new movements, new entities, and you see people instantly investing in that. Even though Black Lives Matter, started in 2013, it is still a relatively young movement. I think for all of us, Craig, what we can learn from that is whether you're a legacy organization like the ones that many of us have worked in, or whether you are just starting out, every day we're going to be forced to innovate. And every day we are going to need to step forward and to be able to express how we are changing and how we are meeting the needs of those that we're serving.
Thank you. And I think it's sort of, and what you really captured when you put pen to paper, that sort of got inspired by like, oh, we finally at this sort of point where something is going to be dramatically different, but then at the same time, I'm like pulled back by like, oh my goodness, like what's taken us to here is just is traumatic. Philanthropy, though, I think is very interesting in that like there's been a lot of talk around systems change the last few years. So we might actually be equipped to finally do something. Right? We've for so long been on point sort of solutions, like, all right, hunger will solve it by giving you food, as opposed to the system, right? So I don't know, it's an interesting sort of time for this all to be happening. Jethro, how are you sort of thinking about this, and how is this sort of coming to life in your work?
First of all, thank you, Craig, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here with Tycely to have this conversation, and thank you, Tycely, for those remarks. I think this is a really difficult time for philanthropy. I mean, I think there's certainly examples we can point to in the past of where philanthropy and philanthropists have really been a force for change in the past. Lots of very specific examples of that certainly are worth celebrating, but I think more often as we look in the past, it feels to me like philanthropy has served to support institutions that have upheld white supremacy, and that philanthropy has not done enough to push for the change that we need to have in this country. And that philanthropists themselves, especially white philanthropists and historically white institutions, have a lot of work to do to acknowledge their historical role in white supremacy, and to have a lot of work to do to decenter whiteness within the nonprofit sector. And that's not going to be something that happens overnight, but I think it's a conversation that's too long in coming, and I think there have been spurts of it over time, but I don't feel like it's been the ongoing conversation that we need to have. So if we're entering into a period of ongoing conversation, I'm pleased with that, but I just think there's a lot of work to do, and I think a lot of acknowledgement of the past and thinking about how we do approach things differently. For Planned Parenthood as a healthcare provider specifically, we certainly think a lot about inequities in our healthcare system, and there's been more conversation about that, about inequities in healthcare as it relates to COVID specifically over the last couple months, and how the pandemic has had an inequitable impact in communities of color. But for those of us who work in healthcare, we know that that's not something new because of this pandemic. That's something that's existed for a long time in the healthcare system, and that hasn't been addressed sufficiently by philanthropy within healthcare. Again, not to say that there aren't great examples of success in doing so, but that philanthropy hasn't pushed hard enough and consistently enough for decentering whiteness within philanthropy and ensuring that healthcare can be provided in an equitable way across the country. And you don't need to look any further than outcomes within our space in sexual and reproductive health to understand the inequities within the healthcare system, differences in maternal mortality rates among women of color versus white women, so many other healthcare outcomes to look at. So I just feel like, Craig, there's great conversation to be having, but there's just a lot of.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, a couple of things that jumped out of me there in your remarks, right? Like, one of the one of the scary things about sort of our sector as we turn and look sort of internally, I'll tell you, when I started out in the nonprofit world, I was, like many people, on the program side of the house, sort of very junior, very entry level. And guess what? I was the only white man, right? Like it was a very diverse set of people that worked at that level in a nonprofit. And then as I branched into fundraising, and now that I'm in a role where I tend to only deal with the leadership of organizations, it doesn't look very diverse anymore, right? Like everybody looks like me now. So it's interesting, like the sector itself, while sort of combating outside forces, and we want equity in healthcare, and we want to do this, and we want to do that, we haven't done a great job inside, right? So I think there are things for us to do from a mission perspective, as well as sort of an inside in our sector, in our organizations perspective as well, to just get better and be different. So, I mean, now may be the time that this finally plays out differently, and I think that's what we all hope, and that's what we will all sort of act towards. So in the context of all of this, right, so that's happening. We've had the pandemic, we've upturned the world, the economy is sort of, depending on the hour you look at the market, either going off the edge of a cliff, or you realize that maybe the market isn't the economy because nobody's working, yet the market goes up, right? So whatever's happening in the world, there's enormous stress on each of us personally right now. There's enormous stress on your teams. There's enormous stress on your donors. So first, I'd want to start with sort of how are each of you kind of balancing your work commitments with your sort of personal commitments in the midst of this total chaos. And then how are you sort of bringing that to life and giving space within the teams that you lead so that they can do the same. And Tycely, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that first.
Absolutely. Well, kudos to you for centering and introducing and challenging us all to ensure that when we look at our teams, when we look at the composition of our teams, to make sure those of us that are in leadership position and those of us who are members of teams, that we all are using our voices. And what I found, Craig, that we've really needed to do, you're asking about how do you model this whole work-life balance, probably with like a question mark and an eyebrow raise, like, is there really such thing as like work-life balance? For me, the two things that I try to do is I try to integrate and I try to align. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. When I first started out as a frontline fundraiser, one of my mentors said to me, you need to be an interesting person. No one wants to talk to someone who can't deposit something interesting, thoughtful, insightful into a conversation. So early on, I realized, well, not only do I have to like jump on this hamster wheel, figure out how to bring in dollars, but I have to find time to like have a hobby, read a book, right? Listen to a podcast, because when I get in front of someone, I actually need to like talk to them about something and be able to like converse. And so even in the here and now, I am so committed to ensuring that when I'm reaching out to partners, And when I'm having conversations, that I'm not just talking about America's Promise Alliance, that I am posing questions, I am giving, and I'm looking forward to what I think their response is going to be about what their needs are, and I'm prepared to offer insights and solutions, right? Because like you said, we're all like in these really strange places and spaces. And so I'm trying to integrate other elements into my life other than America's Promise Alliance. And by doing that, it actually helps me leading fundraising at America's Promise, because I'm able to have something of value to contribute to the team, to contribute to those people that I'm talking to. And so I think, Craig, trying to just align those things, not necessarily balance them, but trying to create space and opportunity for the things that bring me joy, because I'm going to be a better team leader when I'm happy. Those things that inform me, so that when I'm creating strategy, I'm actually increasing our probability of being successful, and so I say, hey, I need to actually calendar time to read the New York Times, or calendar time to listen to this podcast, because all of those things are helping me be a better leader. And so I'm just hoping that I will be able to remain committed to some of these norms, even as we step outside of the current space that we're in, because I really think it's forced me to integrate rather than to choose.
That's great. And it's, I think, that whole idea of like, you have to be an interesting person. I think early on in my career, I know for sure that was something that started to get lost, right? Like, I took a lot of management lessons from the Jerry Maguire movie, like, right, which was big kind of when I first sort of came out of school. And, there's the one guy who's like, oh, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So I was like, well, I can just work all the time. It doesn't matter. Then thankfully, I kind of met my wife, and that changed. And I got married and realized, oh, there's other things. But it's specifically the moment where it clicked. I remember I interviewed for a job. The person that I interviewed against was much more experienced than I was, and I got it. And we both worked together, and I got promoted. And I remember asking him, like, why? Like, he's better than me, raising more money, more experience, whatever. And the answer was, you're just more interesting to talk to, right? And it came down to that like idea of, you're not just doing work all day. You actually have other things going on in your life, and harder to do now, maybe a little bit, but in this environment, but still important. Jethro, so how are you sort of balancing your personal and professional? And so how are you giving your team the space to do the same?
It's been really challenging. It's, I don't know, how many weeks has it been since mid-March? I mean, we've all been working from home over that time period. And it's been difficult for the team. I mean, certainly have had people who've been personally impacted by COVID in one way or another, on the themselves have been sick, or have had family who have been sick in one way or another related to COVID or not. And obviously so many people have kids out of school and who are now trying to, play homeschool teacher for their kids, as well as parent, as well as colleague, everything else. So we've tried to provide a lot of flexibility around expectations for staff. I mean, from a policy perspective, our HR team is great working with us and providing some additional time off for staff who are sick, who need to take care of a loved one, and we've actually extended that just in the last few days to that extra time off can be used for self-care or for social protest. For people who want to go out and do that, as well as make sure that they have the time and do that if they want to do that. So I think from a policy perspective, we've tried to provide some flexibility, and then really tried to work with the managers in our teams who are working daily with colleagues to try to understand how they're doing and really check in with them. The kind of relationships that you describe, and really getting to know staff well. Of course, managing that manager-employee balance, but really understanding how staff are doing at this time. I feel like we've missed the water cooler kitchen conversations that we used to have that I miss so much, but it emphasizes even more the importance of really checking in with people, understanding how they're doing, and are they in a headspace to be productive today? Because if they're not, you've got to give them the space to do what they need to do. And I think that was really important in the first few weeks after the pandemic hit, but I think it's become even more important in the last couple. With so many members of the team who are very personally impacted by everything that we talked about and all the horrible things that have happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Like every day we're hit with another one, it seems. So I think just the flexibility and the personal relationships have allowed us to be supportive.
Yeah, no, and I think it's actually a great reminder even for me, right? I remember at the very beginning, I was very good about having these one-on-one check-ins with staff just because I was like, look, everybody's in this weird place. Let me make sure you're okay. And as this has become normal, I've probably not been as good at that, right? Like I'm sort of into my own head and my own sort of stuff, and I just got to get my work done. But you're right, I do think whether this goes on another 3 weeks or another 3 months or another 3 years, that sort of discipline of really connecting with people one-on-one is more important than ever, and really understanding where they are. And I've also found like I could tell you to balance things and sort of take the time, but you got to model it too, right? Like, so for me, it's been as simple as like, I have lunch with my kids every day, and everybody on my team knows that. Like, I'll move a meeting because it has to happen. I need a half hour at some point to do that. And then I try and end the day too. Like I put holds in my calendar, like, hey, look, I'm ending this day at 5:30, 6, whatever it is. Don't give me anything else after that. So anyway, I think there's lots there. So let's shift a little bit to donors. So Jethro, like, question everybody's asking, like, what's the right way to engage with donors right now? Can you engage with donors right now? How are you and your team doing that? How are you interacting with your donors and your prospects?
I mean, we have to, right? That's our jobs, right? We're here to do that on behalf of our organization, and all of our organizations have important goals to accomplish. And so yes. So I mean, I would say, we have been very affected by the inability to do in-person meetings with donors. A lot of our major come from one-on-one meetings. We have a large team of major gift officers who normally be out interacting with donors. We don't do a lot of ticketed events at the national office. Our affiliates do around the country and have been very impacted by that. We certainly have to cancel a national stewardship event we had planned for the spring, but we've replaced it with these style webinars. And we've had actually very good turnout for those webinars, and in fact, much better turnout for the webinars that replaced the in-person event that would be for a particular day in Chicago. Much better turnout for the webinars that we've done in place of that than we had in Chicago. I'm not sure it's the same kind of interaction, but we certainly have had success engaging in that way. And I'd say we've had success engaging in the one-on-one as well. It seems like people are answering the phone more often, and certainly answering their home line more often than they ever did before. And we're also asking for gifts and talking about the work no different than we've been together in person, and have been pleasantly surprised by the ability to ask for large gifts by phone and by video. So I think the kind of interactions are different in a webinar, and there's lots of adult education, which I'm not an expert in, behind that, but be able to lean into that in any way as much as possible to understand what the science tells us will work with people in a big Zoom meeting, which is different than an in-person conversation. But certainly we've been engaging both on large scale and on one-on-one in the same or similar ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. Tycely, how about you? What's been your experiences? Are you soliciting gifts? And to the degree you are, like, is there a particular type of donor or type of audience where you're seeing better traction than others?
Absolutely. So I think Jethro is absolutely right. We have to give thought to how we say yes to the roles and the responsibilities that we have. We historically have measured our success by solicitations, and we've quantified those solicitations as it pertains to an individual portfolio. And the measure of success is usually, all right, let's assume you've got to bring in $1 million. Do you have $3 million of ask out? So I've decreased the emphasis on the solicitation and increased the emphasis on the stewardship. So what I am asking every individual within America's Promise Alliance, and notice I didn't just say within the development department, but every individual within America's Promise Alliance, to actively engage in stewardship. And they could determine who they wanted to steward. We put forth examples on how they could steward, but everyone was going to take this opportunity to be an ambassador, and everyone was going to take this opportunity to lighten the load of the development department. I think it's critically important to also, like Jethro was saying, to use terms that are inviting. And so we literally invite people to invest. And we try to use the term invest because we feel as if we can demonstrate a return on the investment. And going back to what we were saying earlier about nomenclature, you know, there's this perception that philanthropy is just like yesterday, right? That philanthropy doesn't necessarily produce anything other than, you know, an annual report, or philanthropy doesn't really result into anything other than, you know, a reference in social media. And I am all about finding a way to demonstrate to investors that there is a positive return, and not necessarily the word impact. I kind of have different, I'm trying to determine how I feel about impact. You know, Craig, this might be the time for me to just lift my feet up and you and Jethro can help me think through the term impact. But we are seeing that a lot of our institutional partners reached out immediately saying, hey, we'd like to make an investment. But they were really curious to know, how will this investment reach local communities? And that was a question that historically we had not necessarily seen before, but they really wanted to know, how will this investment, I'm assuming you have the ability to scale, you're making this efficient for me, and I'm hoping that you're going to distribute this beyond, you know, the constraints of the District of Columbia. So we want to hear how you're doing that. And with some of our corporate gifts, we really had to discern whether or not we were in a position to say yes to the terms. So I think this has been an opportunity for us to pivot back to our gift acceptance policy. It's a way for us to determine, you know, what we say yes to. But we've also seen an increase of in-kind contributions, and that's been really exciting. We've seen more individuals giving, but people giving at fewer dollar amounts. And so the growth, right, it depends upon what you're counting. We've seen an increase in gifts, but the gift size has pretty much decreased a tad bit year over year. So there's opportunity, obviously, for us to renew those gifts, hopefully upgrade them. But I think people, Craig, are very mindful of the delicate economic state that we're in right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's been an interesting behavior, which I think gets right to what you're saying around sort of number of gifts increasing, but gift size sort of not decreasing. Like, I've been impressed, frankly, by how well sort of low dollar direct marketing, sort of mass fundraising has performed over these months. Like, that's one of those things in past downturns, you've sort of seen that pull back pretty quickly. if anything, that's actually accelerated through this. Now, again, as the economic situation sort of takes hold and takes some length to it, who knows if that'll continue. But people have been responding well to that sort of solicitation really throughout. Like the people that didn't stop sort of when the world started shutting down, and sort of most cases because they couldn't, like they probably would have, but they were unable to sort of claw back the mail that had already hit. They've done well, and they've sort of kept going, and they've seen good results. So that sort of matches, I think, a little bit of what your experience has been. But I do think you're right. Those bigger gifts, people are holding back a little bit because it's like, well, I don't really know what the economic situation is going to be. Like, I still want to give. I'm probably confident enough that whatever the situation is, the economy will come back. Like we've all now lived through enough of these things. But yeah, that definitely is matching sort of the experiences that we're seeing. I want to talk a little bit about sort of, well, let me take one of the questions from the Q&A here. And this is a great question. So what advice do you have for nonprofits on how to diversify their major gifts portfolios, which largely replicate dominant white hierarchical systems? I'm not going to put anyone on the spot because that's a tough one. So who does everyone want to volunteer to take that one? How do you diversify your donor base?
I mean, I'm happy to start because it is something we've been thinking a lot about over the last couple of years. And I do think you do need to start by looking in a little bit before you look out, right? And what does your fundraising team look like, and what kind of diversity is there on your fundraising? And understanding that having some diversity on your fundraising team or having a high level diversity on your fundraising team can lead to richer conversations inside about how we the fund. That's, I think, sort of question one. Question two is then still looking at your sort of internal systems, and have you done the internal work as an organization to think about diversity, equity, and inclusivity within the organization so that you're appropriately ready to have conversations with donors when they start asking questions about what have you done as an organization to be worthy of my gift. So I think there's a lot of internal work to do, and as you start to think about, okay, looking at donor bases, and then I think there's work to be done in terms of what's the messaging and understanding your messaging for different audiences, and part of that is having a diverse team that's putting together the messaging that can help think through how are different people going to react to what our messaging has been, and is the word impact going to resonate with one audience or another audience? And maybe the word impact resonates really well with a white audience in their 60s, but maybe it doesn't resonate as well with their audiences, whatever the case may be. Just use that example we talked about. So I think there's a lot of that work to happen before, and then it's okay. What does our donor base look like currently? And we can make lots of assumptions. How do we know? We talk to people. We start having conversations. We ask people to make introductions. How do we grow our fundraising base? If any other way, we do it through kinds of acquisition. We do networking. So I don't think those strategies are necessarily different, but sort of setting yourself up. So that's some of the work that we've been doing, thinking through, moving towards over the years, and fortunate to have some great internal leaders within our development team who've been providing some leadership for us. But it's also, it's not a short term, this is long term.
Shelley, anything to add on that, or how do you all think about sort of diversifying your donor base and particularly your major gift portfolios?
So I think it's an excellent question. I think I am really trying to shift a bit of the culture. I think going back to the point that Jethro made, generally speaking, the strategy and the tactics are the same. I'm dealing with a situation where the organization has not necessarily viewed those of us who have externally facing responsibilities as being able to bring back valuable insight from the outside. And so I think one of the most important contributions we can make as ambassadors is to make sure we are not merely viewed as a one-way extension to pass along the message, but because we're talking, because we're listening, because we're observing, we have insights on what the market wants, on how the market wants to see it messaged. And so when our viewpoint as frontline fundraisers, when we're valued and we're able to have cross-departmental conversations with the marketing team, when we're able to have conversations with human resources, when we're really able to help all dimensions of the organization see what the appropriate value proposition should be, then we're going to be better successful. And so I think we start by making sure we understand and see racially and culturally diverse additions as a positive, right? I think you'll see some people who will just make an ignorant assumption that all of this money, right, is just being given. And it's like, hey, we need to now get Black people in our donor base because the Black people are over here making millions of dollars of contributions to these things that seem to be important to the Black people. And it isn't just that the Black people are making these contributions. Contributions are coming in not only from Black people, but from people who aren't Black because they think for the first time there's a probability to see something working and to see a system deconstructed and to see a social ill put to rest, right? And so I think we have to be really intentional, I think, about our messaging and about what we are inviting people to do. And I think we've got to be crystal clear on whether or not we're creating ample value in the marketplace. And I know that that probably comes across a little harsh, but if we are not innovating, right? If we have settled into this static place and space where we are just churning out the same offerings that we churned out in the 80s and the 90s, and then, like, it becomes really difficult to attract any type of donor, right? Much less a donor that you've overlooked and that you haven't cultivated. And so I would say that I think it's important to prioritize having people within the inside who can give you guidance on the best way to create strategies. And to Jethro's point, not only prioritize having those people placed in the development department, but especially within the communication, marketing. It's critical because that's where I've seen the most missteps, even when you've got a Black or fundraiser of color who can build the bridge. They don't have the tools, right? What they're pulling out is a leave behind and there aren't any Black faces, or what they're pulling out is language that clearly wasn't tested amongst, a racially diverse population. And so even your frontline fundraisers who are people of color, we need the appropriate tools in order to successfully create and continue to establish a long-term relationship with those donors.
100%. And just two things I want to sort of tease out of there, which were fantastic. And sort of this idea of sort of your leave behind materials and sort of the overall organizational voice. I said this to a group earlier today. I 100% earlier in my career was one of these marketing and brand don't matter, give me, 25 minutes and a couple of brochures and I'll sell anything, right? Like it doesn't matter. that's BS, right? Like probably it was bull then, but it's definitely now. Like the voice and sort of brand of an organization is now so much more encompassing and so much more relevant to a fundraiser because I can't say one thing and my website says something different. I was with somebody yesterday. They said our website, well, for funders go here, for participants go here. I was like, FYI, like if I'm the funder, the first thing I'm going to do is click the participants and see what you think you don't want me to see, right? So like you have to have this voice that sort of stresses what the fundraiser is going to say. So I just think that whole idea has to be so much more integrated than ever was, particularly, as you said, if I want to attract audiences that I haven't attracted before, because the messaging has to sort of be all on the same page. And then you said something there too around like the market value. I've never really been able to articulate this in a great way, but I've always had this idea that like, even if you didn't need fundraising as a nonprofit, right? Lots of nonprofits, we'll get earned revenue, whatever. It is an amazing way to test your relevance in the market, because if people won't give you money in your community, whatever your community is, that says a lot about how they're valuing the services that your organization is putting out. So I think it's all so intertwined. As this has been happening, Jethro, I've been thinking a lot about a conversation the two of us had over lunch, literally, I think just a couple of weeks before this all started. And we were both sort of bemoaning, kids these days and wanting to work from home and, trying to be like, hey, this is the way things work. Well, now we're all working from home. I'm curious, like, how has that transition gone for you and your team? And do you think this is like, what is the permanent change in sort of the way we're going to work together, do you think, coming out of this, whatever out of this is?
Yeah, I've sort of been a traditionalist on this, as you know, Craig, and certainly as my team knows, in terms of work from home. And because I do think the in-person interactions are very valuable. I do think you missed that, and I do think we've been seeing that. I don't know what the productivity is in our current status, and I'm not even sure how exactly we measure that, but certainly doesn't really matter at the moment, frankly, because we've got to put the safety and the health of our team members ahead of productivity questions. But obviously there will come a point down the road when we're going to have to think about the future, and we may have less occupancy. We may be that we can only have 50% of the people in the same space we had 100 people before, but now we can only have 50 people, and okay, we got to figure out what does that mean in terms of work from home. And I'm concerned about it, because I do think and I do feel like there's been a lot of times in my professional career where I can point to the opportunities to have interacted with work alongside, who work elsewhere in the organization, have made a difference in the work. And I also understand people have different styles, and I also understand that this can be an issue that we need to figure out how to support people in maximizing their productivity going forward. I'm sort of caught, Craig, to be honest, between my personal feelings about what I know I've seen throughout my career, and wanting to be supportive of other people in terms of how they can be most productive, but at the moment recognizing that it's sort of a very academic conversation at the moment, because we've got to put health and safety ahead of even questions of productivity. But then I'll come back to me in 6 months. Let's talk about it again.
I think it's something we're all going to be talking a lot about for a while. I think you're right. Like my instinct has been like, it worked better than I thought it was going to work. Like I'll say that straight up, right? Like I would have thought it would have been more challenging than it's been, but also recognizing like my scenario is pretty easy for it, right? Like I have a dedicated space in my house, right? I'm not sort of sitting at the kitchen table. My kids are 10 and 13, so they kind of can do their own thing. I don't have a toddler. I don't have a sick relative to take care of. My wife's a teacher. She can do her, so I have probably the ideal situation for it. And you're right, everybody's sort of got different things. As we sort of round towards the back end of this conversation here, Tycely, I'd be curious to you as we sort of start thinking about some closing thoughts, people. Though I would say, if you have questions, or another question popped up here, put them into the Q&A. I see a bunch of questions in the chat around if there's a video, if the recording of this will be available. You'll get an email with the recording and it'll be on the Orr Group website. So yes, to answer that question, and I'll come to the question of the Q&A in a second. But Tycely, what sort of, like, as you look back now, what's a piece of fundraising advice that you wish you'd been given when you started that you would give to somebody now?
My bit of advice would be to chair your personal board of directors. It took me a long time to advocate for myself, to understand that I was the only person responsible for my health and my happiness. And I think it's really important, no matter where you are within an organization, whether you're leading teams, whether you're an invaluable part of a team, to recognize that we have not been called to be martyrs. We are not called to work 18-hour days, sleep 2 hours, not receive a raise in 5 years, all for the mission. You know, it is critically important for us to recognize the individual value that we have and to ensure that we're advocating for what we need in order to uphold the roles and the responsibilities for the organizations that we've made a commitment to share our talent and time with. It is just very, very painful for me witnessing colleagues put so much into the work and not have hardly anything left for themselves, their families, their friends. And at the end of the day, it may seem as if you're doing what's best for the organization, but day after day, when you're coming into the office and you're tired and you're irritated and you're frustrated, you aren't bringing your best self to the table. And so I would remind my younger self to assess whether or not an organization and within that organization would bring me happiness and would place me on a path that was healthy. And when and if you receive signals that is not likely the case, you know, sometimes systems are really hard to deconstruct, right? Sometimes the status quo is really hard to change. And I think it's important for individuals to always recognize that we have choice. Getting up and going to work is a choice, and our employers should value us and they should appreciate the choice that we make each and every day to give and do our best. And when you find yourself in situations where you don't feel valued, activate your individual freedoms and make a better choice.
That's great. Jethro, I'm going to come to you in 1 second with that same idea of, piece of advice you give your younger self. But there's a question here about, and I'll just answer it quick. There's so many needs across the spectrum. Are you seeing donors choose to give one large sum to one place or sort of spread smaller gifts? I would say the trend I've seen for years now is people wanting to make a bigger impact, whether you can afford 500 or 500,000, you're more and more likely to give it to one place as opposed to spread it to other places. It'll be interesting to see, do people try and, now in this moment, go, I can give half to pandemic stuff and half to social justice? I don't know. But generally, I think that trend of bigger gifts to fewer organizations will continue. So Jethro, as we close out here, what piece of advice you'd give yourself, something you know now you wish we would have known 10, 15, 20 years ago?
I think just following on Tycely's analogy a little bit, and I love sort of the chair of the board imagery, but I think having some other people around the board table too, and having some good mentors or other advisors, and mentor has such a very specific connotation sometimes. that's not the right way to think about it, but just people who, even in more informal snippets of time over the course of your career, who you can come back to and you can pick their brain, and they'll provide a helpful piece of advice at one time or another. And I think bringing it back to the equity conversation where we started, though, I think this is an area in which, within our field of fundraising, there can be times where people, fundraisers of color, don't have the same advantage of building those networking relationships, supporting, getting the kind of support that white folks may. So I do think that's something we need to think about as a field, in terms of how do we provide and ensure that we're being equitable in terms of opportunities that people are being given and the connections that people are being given, are very important as we think about career, and certainly as we look back on a career and think about the support.
Excellent, thank you. I always sort of judge the success of a conversation on if I leave sort of thinking about the conversation and it made me think about some things. And both of you did that this afternoon, as I knew you would for me. I'm sure you did it for the couple hundred folks that were here. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank all the participants. You'll get a link also to a survey. We'd love your feedback. What would you like us to talk about or hear about? But more importantly, I would say to you, fundraising, tough job. You're going to hear no more than you're going to hear yes. It's only going to get harder. It is not going to get easier. But thank you for what you do, because you make the world a better place. It might not feel that way on average Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but I promise you, you do. And we appreciate what you do. I'm grateful to get to be one of you, work with you. That's it. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Tycely, Jethro, thank you very, very, very much.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.